Hi, this is my historical timeline by Libby Popejoy, and my next few slides are just going to give you a brief history of how bilingual education came to how it is today. So the first one we have is Myers versus Nebraska, which is from 1923, and it all kind of started with the act called the Simon Act, which passed in 1919 and prohibited all schools from teaching any foreign language. And although technically it was prohibited, foreign language education still did occur after school hours or during recess. So who we're talking about today is Robert Myers, and he continued to teach a Bible study in German after the Simon Act was passed. And he would kind of slide around the law a little bit by giving his Bible lessons in extended recess hours. However, one day when he was giving his German Bible lesson, someone actually walked in on his lesson and he got turned in. So he was taken to court and he was actually found guilty in Nebraska. And then Meyer actually brought his case to the U.S. Supreme Court later. And the U.S. Supreme Court stated that states have control over usual school hour instruction. However, they actually don't have any say outside the regular day. So then we go to 1954, which is the famous Brown versus Board of Education. And the main point of Brown versus Board of Education was to end the segregation and discrimination that was occurring inside schools. So although at this point it was considered separate but equal, it was very far from it. At the African American schools, it had very tattered buildings, not very well-written textbooks. Everything was kind of falling apart. So although they did have a school, it was not equal whatsoever. So this particular case had a huge role in making equal education opportunity a large focus of government policies. And it was ruled in 1954, actually, that racial segregation in schools was in fact illegal. However, it wasn't until around the early 1970s that all the schools in the U.S. were obeying the law. So it took kind of around 20-ish years, a little less, to actually get that into action. And surprisingly, the law making this was unanimous, which I found very interesting for this time period. So the next one that we have is the National Defense Education Act of 1958. And this act was taken into effect because the Soviets' acceleration in the space race and the U.S. felt that they were kind of falling behind the Soviet Union in science and technology because of this huge idea that was going around, trying to get to space and everything. So once the U.S. felt that they were kind of lingering behind in science and technology, the U.S.'s federal government felt like they needed to get more involved of all aspects of the education system to be able to keep up with all the countries and kind of still have be in the competition for high powers. And then along with improving the education system, the NDEA also encouraged secondary education, which is like college and so on. And the government started helping students with secondary education by providing scholarships to students who excelled in subjects such as math, science, engineering, etc. And the legislature passed, and the federal funding was legitimate. This act helped many students who would not have been able to afford college on their own dime. It helped them get into college and feel comfortable, and then as well as helping the U.S. Get people into college, therefore helping us in the future and keeping up with the other countries. And then the next act that I have for us is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is a super important act. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was followed by Brown versus Board of Education. And this act actually brought all the inequality and discriminations that African Americans face every day. So it kind of brought to light everything that was happening to them on a daily basis that was so wrong. And this act actually banned discrimination against race, sex, and national origin in all public places. So this really did kind of bring everything together into one act to say that you can't discriminate based on if you're a boy or a girl, if you're African American or Caucasian, or no matter where you're from. So that was a super important act. And then the next one that we're going to talk about today is Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. And this law is mostly about children who are living in poverty. So this law brought poverty to the United States and demanded better education to those in poverty. It brought the awareness of poverty to the United States. And it made it equal to those who are not in poverty and those who are. So it kind of makes it where the schools they're not based on where you live or whatever. It's more based on, okay, everybody needs a great education. So this law was put in place to close the skill gaps in reading, writing, and math between low-income families and middle-class families, because the low-income families were mostly going to low-end schools that didn't have the best resources and programs for their students. They were kind of falling behind, whereas the middle-class families had a lot of resources, great teachers at their schools. And although this seemed like a great idea, the impact seemed to wear out eventually, and the priorities of the U.S. funds shifted. So the next we have the Bilingual Education Act of 1968, also known as the BEA. And there were a lot of these, but this is talking about the first one. So the BEA was the first federal intervention of minority students, particularly English language learners. And the lack of bilingual teachers, programs, and assistants caused Spanish speakers to spend, on average, around 4 less years in college than Caucasians. And this was actually the first bilingual act to be passed. So it was kind of hard to see where this act would go and how far the federal government would take it. And with the Bilingual Education Act, the U.S. federal government was supposed to provide financial assistance to fund bilingual programs and resources. And this act mostly targeted low-income and non-English and minimal English students. So next we have Lau versus Nichols, which took place in 1974. And this court case is very important to English language learners of all languages, not just Spanish. So Lau versus Nichols was actually started in California by Chinese Americans who spoke little English. And even though they spoke little English, they were placed in an English-speaking classroom. And though clearly this was wrong, the district said that it wasn't, even after it was brought to the school district's attention by Lau's parents. So once the school district didn't do anything about it, Lau's parents actually took it to court. And once again, it was unanimously voted on that the situation didn't qualify for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So the court said that no, this is not okay, and the Laos won this one. So it says, since the school Lau attended was provided federal funding, it was required to provide equal opportunity to all students. And even though technically the school had equal treatment for all students, the opportunity and meaningful education for the ELLs was very under the English language learners. So the next one I have is Serena versus Portales Municipal Schools, which took place in 1974. And this court case, like Lau's, makes it clear that you cannot simply ignore the disadvantage that English language learners have. And the Serenas was little girl's parents. They actually filed a lawsuit against her school, stating that the district failed to provide bilingual education to children with Spanish surnames. And the Sternas actually won the case, later requiring Portales Municipal School to create bilingual programs that specialized in children with Spanish surnames. And this was actually the first successful case seeking support for bilingual education. The next one we have is Rio versus Reed. And it was brought to a parent's attention that the school's quote unquote bilingual program was simply a class spoken in English and not giving any instruction in Spanish, which would be nearly impossible for an English language learner to understand since they are learning it. They can't fully understand it quite yet. So this violated the rights of ELLs by providing a half-hearted bilingual program that relied on ESL, and the court recognized the need to keep a class that was bilingual rather than a program for English as a second language students. And a ruling later called for the use of L1 instruction in the core areas while developing English. And although no remedies were issued, the Office of Civil Rights made sure that the school did make appropriate changes later on to help the success of the ELL and ESL students. So the last one that I'm going to talk about today is Otero versus Mesa County Valley School District, which took place in 1980. And by this time, the courts were starting to kind of lose interest in bilingual education programs. And this case failed an attempt to give a court order for bilingual education. And the way that this had started was they were going to plan to do it just as the court case United States versus Texas. However, that didn't work out, possibly because only 3% of the students could speak Spanish. And then the court later stated that although U.S. versus Texas did pass, there was not a constitutional connection to bilingual education. So even though it was kind of starting to build momentum up for a bit, it doesn't mean that it was something that was 1000% necessary to have in the United States. Thank you.